You're not going to be foolish enough to move on from me. I may deal with the fact that we're not together to some extent, but you're not going to move on. And nobody else is going to touch you. Nobody else is going to love you. Nobody else is going to be in that role except for me. So if you don't want to be with me, I'm not going to kill you necessarily, but you're going to go through life alone. We've talked about specific intimate partner homicide cases, and we will continue to pay tribute to women who have been murdered by partners and exes and potential partners, and we'll continue to look at the red flags in those situations as well. We've also looked a little bit at attempted murders. Some of these women have survived things that I just can't even imagine. It doesn't always end in death. For some people, life continues, and never without it being impacted. I'm an example of that too. I'm on here doing this. I wrote a book. I got to go talk to a high school, which was super cool. I do these things so that I can educate people, women in particular, about domestic violence, stalking, intimate partner homicide, because these are things that people did not talk to me about and I had to learn the hard way. And I want to try to help people avoid that or get out of that if at all possible, because when you've experienced anything down this road, it changes you. Today, what we're going to look at is a different way that they can control. So sometimes they control through stalking. Sometimes they control through physical violence. Sometimes they control through sexual violence. Sometimes they use coercive control and it's a mental, emotional thing. That's actually very common and probably there in most abusive relationships. Sometimes they control by murder. You know, if I can't have you, nobody else will either. Sometimes, like what we're going to talk about today, they control by killing the people that you try to move on with. If you don't want to be with me, I'm not going to kill you necessarily, but you're going to go through life alone. And you don't have to have gone through that for that control thing to be there, because just knowing that this happens can be enough for some people to not date again and not get married again. But for me personally, there was definitely threats against future people if I was to try to get with anybody else. And so after abusers, I did not go out and date somebody else. Like for years, I didn't go out and date other people because A, it wasn't worth the hassle to me. You're already dealing with all of that trauma. You don't necessarily need more because somebody else is involved. And B, I didn't want to put anybody else at risk because they may not know my exes, but I do. I thought that I was going to pick about 4 cases. I think there's like 6 or 7, so we're not going to go into them very detailed. I just want to give you guys an idea of some different scenarios that have happened in the news, not in the terribly distant past, but I want to make you aware of this particular aspect of control too. Authorities say that 48-year-old Michael Imana shot and killed 38-year-old David Nilsson. Imana's ex-wife called 911. When investigators got there, she told them that her ex-husband had shot her new boyfriend and then took his body with him. And the deputies later found Nelson dead inside of this car once they had searched for it and found it. Jessica Martin, who was 35, died as part of this attack. She was 8 months pregnant and she was shot when her ex-boyfriend, Jeffrey Lynn Martin, who was 47, stormed her home on September 24th. I want to note the age difference there. This is a red flag. It seems like when there is 10 or more years of age difference and the older person is the aggressor, that seems to be an intimate partner homicide tied red flag. So here, 12 years age difference, armed with a baseball bat, which he grabbed when Martin came in. Her boyfriend and the father of the unborn child, 40-year-old Richard Cook, was killed trying to protect her. After shooting Jessica and Richard, then Martin went out into a wooded area, if I understand it right, across the road from the house and killed himself. Doctors did perform a cesarean on Jessica to try to save the baby, but that didn't work. In this case, the ex-husband hadn't been heard from in 10 years before he showed up and started threatening his ex-wife a couple of days before the murder-suicide. Her family said that he had been stalking her from the wooded area across the road for at least that few days. They didn't give motive that I had seen, but my guess would be she moved on and there was a baby on the way and he caught wind of it. And I wanted to highlight this case in particular because lots of people misunderstand domestic violence, misunderstand stalking, misunderstand intimate partner homicide. And they will tell you, if you're in a situation like this, well, it's been 6 months and you haven't heard from them. It's been 2 months and you haven't heard from them. It's been a year, 2 years, 10 years, and you haven't heard from them, they're no longer a threat. And I don't believe that's true. I think that once they have fixated on you, there's a part of that that's gonna stay. I had an ex that had no contact with me for like 2 or 3 years, and then he just happened to get brought up by the counselor. We were talking about him, and she was like, I'm sure he's moved on to somebody else by this point. I don't think that you need to worry about him anymore. He's fixated on somebody new. It's been a couple of years. You're fine. And then like the next week he got a hold of me, and actually he tried to get a hold of me again not too long ago, and we haven't been together in 8 or 9 years. So they don't forget. I don't know exactly what the motive was in this case, but they don't forget. The next one, I'm definitely going to butcher the name. I apologize in advance. This guy's name is N-G-O-N, Nong. Last name T-R-U-O-N-G, Nong Truong, or Tom, as his neighbors referred to him, so that's how I'm going to refer to him. He's 47 years old. He and his ex-wife is what it's listed as. One of the neighbors said as far as she knew, they were still married, living together, had kids together, but it's listed as ex-wife. She's dating this new guy, this 24-year-old. So 47, 24, that probably didn't trip his trigger in a great way anyway. The husband and wife are fighting out in the street, and the new boyfriend steps in and says, hey, don't yell at her like that. So Tom goes to his truck, pulls out a gun, and shoots and kills the 24-year-old. Aside from the age difference and the fact that they were still living in the same house, but she was dating somebody else, which I definitely wouldn't recommend, especially if there was any kind of abuse. You don't want to look for ways to create issues. In these cases, a lot of times just the simple act of dating somebody else is enough to create an issue, let alone doing it while you're still living together and that seeming kind of like rubbing it in their face. Don't do that. Tom claimed that there was a struggle between him and the victim. Detectives say that evidence points to murder, not self-defense. Next one happened in December of 2018, but it has different components. It's interesting that I wanted to be able to point out. 35-year-old Tyler Catlin Borg gunned down his wife's ex-boyfriend after pretending to be her in text messages to lure him. What actually happened was they had dated before these two got married. There was conflict in the marriage pretty much the whole time that the marriage existed, is what I've read. And so they reconnected somehow and then started texting. They apparently met up at one point and just talked. Her husband confronted her about it because she had said she'd gone to the mall, and he was like, I know that you're lying because I put a tracking device on your car. I'm gonna put that most recent video up here warning people about one of the really common things that people are doing right now to track your car, just so that you're aware. But he put a tracker on her car. He knew that she wasn't where she said she was. She denied it, she argued, and then later on he got a hold of her phone and was going through her phone, found text messages between the two of them. They had continued to text, and the text got more sexual, and they talked about how they had wished that they would have had sex when they had seen each other that day and stuff. So he goes to his wife, says the marriage is over, I'm gonna take you to your parents. Takes her to her parents, keeps her phone though, and then texts this guy as if he is her, getting him all excited about the idea of meeting up, telling him to come to her parents' house. Takes the wife to the parents' house, still texting this guy while armed, and then he goes to where she was supposed to meet him and he shoots him 5 times. So in this case, it was not her finding somebody new, but her being willing to become involved with somebody from her past. It's still becoming involved with somebody else. So it doesn't necessarily have to be somebody that you have met since. Also, GPS tracking is stalking, so he was stalking. Her life was probably in danger had this continued because of the factors there. And then this was considered in the court special circumstances because he lured this guy as if he was her, whose name was not actually given, but he ended up getting life in prison without parole because of it. This next one is actually a 21-year-old case that I put in here so that you could see that this is not like a new phenomenon. This guy was recently executed for the case. It's not new, and I don't believe it's going away. I'm sure it's way, way, way older than this case. I'm just putting it in there for some context. He shot his ex-wife's boyfriend to death and then beat her to death with the gun. This happened in 1997. He would have been around 45 at the time. Donnie Cleveland Lance. Lance called his ex-wife's father and asked if she was home. Father said she wasn't home, so he goes to the boyfriend's house and kicks in the door, shot him with a shotgun, and then beat Sabrina with the butt of the gun, which broke into pieces during the attack. His former wife was Sabrina Joy Lance, and her boyfriend Dwight Butch Wood. In this case, Lance had a history of abusing his ex-wife when they were married. He had kidnapped her, he beat her, he tried to strangle her, and on one occasion he tried electrocuting her with a car battery. He had also repeatedly threatened to kill her, and once asked a relative what it would cost to hire somebody to kill her and would, according to court documents. There are signs. That's something else to take from this. This did not happen in a vacuum. She died. The new boyfriend died. But there were signs. There were indicators. Strangulation is huge. Electrocution is not something that I hear about a ton. So that's something that is a little bit different. But kidnapping, I mean, there are so many things that were red flags before it got to this point. This stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum. Sometimes I get information about the red flags that I can use to be able to point out. Sometimes the articles don't talk about them, but they're there. Pay attention to them in your life, to them in people you know and love's lives, and respond. 31-year-old inmate Joshua Castle faces 4 new felony charges after detectives learned that he made plans to have his wife and her new boyfriend killed. He hired a hit on them while being incarcerated. I don't think he was in prison, I think he was in jail. And then, when he thought he was going to potentially get away with that, which he ended up actually talking to an undercover investigator instead of somebody that was actually going to do a hit. But then he tried to also order a hit on his father-in-law from jail. So this speaks to the seriousness of the commitment here. This is not just an adult thing. 16-year-old Ephraim Escobar of Arizona was shot and killed by his girlfriend's ex-boyfriend, who was 17 years old. And there is not much information on it besides that because they're both minors, so they're not going to say much. But I want you to understand, this is not just an adult issue. I have read of other attempts on people's lives, intimate partners, exes, new partners, all of the above, of teenagers as well. This mentality doesn't start when they're adults, usually. It is something that's there long and deep, and sometimes they start acting on it excessively when they're teenagers. Sometimes it's little by little until they become an adult and get more established. But either way, it's not just an adult issue. This particular news article included a couple of comments. One, this Jacob, who was a neighbor, said, I think everyone was just more kind of shocked, a little shaken up that something like this would happen so close to home. That is a super common reaction in general. People think that this stuff happens, but it doesn't happen where I live. It doesn't happen to my relationship. It doesn't happen in my town. It's always somewhere else. That's a dissociation that is super common with people that's dangerous, because then you assume that it can't happen to you, or it can't happen to somebody that you love. It can't happen to a family member or a friend, and it can. The first step to taking back the power in your life is to understand that you can be a victim. Because if you know that you can, then you can take actions to prevent it. If you're living in this delusion that it's not going to happen to you, it just happens to other people, you will be completely taken by surprise if and when it does happen to you. And that's not what I want. I want you to be safe. I want you to be prepared. The other comment in here that I mean, at this point I find it a little bit entertaining, but it's not entertaining. It's sad. This lady, Olivia, said, "We couldn't believe it. We just couldn't believe it. She lives across the street from the home where the shooting happened." I mean, Tom's not that type of guy. He's a very positive guy. And she went on to talk about how she had hired him as a handyman several times. He's not that type of a person. He's a very positive guy. Well, they let you see what they want you to see. Those of us who have been with them know that personally anyway, that we see a different side of them than maybe everybody else sees. Also, when they first get together with you, you see a different person than what you end up seeing later on when they show you more of their true colors. They show people. These guys are master manipulators, and they will show you what they want you to see.